Okay, so today we got some heavy lecture notes, which is why you're going to be watching the video, stopping and pausing, and doing different activities. Today's big focus is imagery. Now, I know you guys know what imagery is. It's one of the most easily recognizable, discussed features of writing. However, I want to push your guys' discussion of imagery even more so you can see that there's different types of imagery going on as well as different purposes, really pushing the why and the analysis once again, like we've been doing all semester. So the opening activity is a poem by Dickinson. Remember, no titles for Dickinson poems, she just had them numbered. So you're going to read this poem, you're going to pick it apart, you're going to annotate it, and then you're going to discuss it together as a group. When you get ready to discuss it, please voice record so I can hear your thought process. And then you're going to listen to what I came up with for the poem when you get done. So read it, pick it apart, discuss it, go. So I picked this poem by Dickinson because there's imagery going on, but there's auditory imagery. And I don't know if you guys mentioned that or not. If you did, fantastic. But the author really is provoking your sense of sound. And she's trying to recreate sound and create these visions of sound, but in a very unique way. The first thing you'll notice is a lot of the diction choices connect back to that. And you're going to see that imagery is kind of like this big umbrella of creative writing, I guess. And what happens in my mind is all these different little techniques go into imagery. So for instance, things like simile, repetition, onomatopoeia, those are lit devices, they're important, but they kind of help create the imagery at hand. It's like imagery is the big, golden part of the writing, and all these little things are building up and making imagery even more prevalent or strong in a piece. So imagery, in my mind, is one of the most important techniques that you need to know, and it's something that you'll see on the AP test. And just like diction or syntax, it's something that you need to look at, as well as form. So from here on out, you want to ask yourself, what type of imagery is the author using, and why? Why are they using this imagery to begin with? So reading through this poem, I see and hear a lot of sound imagery. I see her invoking different things that create sounds. And I also see her trying to create the illusion of sound with the way that she's structuring her piece. So for instance, in the second to third line, it says, mourners to and fro keep treading, treading. That repetition's very interesting, and it creates this feeling of people going back and forth. That's not so much sound imagery yet, but it's definitely interesting repetition. Then she starts to evoke these different sounds. So the service is like a drum. It keeps beating, beating. So we see the repetition with the sound imagery specifically here. And you can not only, if you shut your eyes, you could not only see the beating of the drum, but you can hear it. So that's how she's able to employ this deeper type of imagery. And then you hear her talk about a creak across my soul, boots of lead, which can be very loud when they're stomping, toll and bell and ear and silence. So she's invoking all of these different images that create sound or remind us of sound. And the next thing you have to ask yourself is why? Like, why would she want all this sound imagery? So I'm going to have you guys pause and ask each other and maybe come up with a response. So why? Why all this sound imagery? Because that's the hard part of the analysis. Go. So what I came up with, and this is kind of on the fly, you might disagree with me here. I think she is trying to create sound imagery because she's trying to help you understand what happens in people's brains and all the things that you hear or don't hear when you're hanging out or thinking to yourself. Also, remember, Emily Dickinson was kind of a hermit. She didn't do much other than watch out her window and write poetry. And so I feel like this poem would make sense, this, obsession with sounds, because that's kind of what her world was, what she could see and maybe what she could hear. I also think it's interesting if you do try to silence the world around you, you can't. And even your brain can't really be silent because you're constantly thinking and different memories pop up and sound pops out. I also think it's interesting you have a funeral in my brain. And when you think about funerals and the different sounds that get used in funerals, all the ones she is using make sense. And if you've ever been through a funeral, it's definitely true that the slightest sound everybody pays attention to. Everybody hears. You have crying going on, but like when other sounds are evoked, a lot of people pay attention to it. Now, what you might have just noticed during me talking is I kind of worked out my ideas as I went. And sometimes I should have actually wrote down this information first, because I think I figured out what the poem is doing now after talking with you guys, and I'm going to argue that she's trying to create the emphasis on funerals, and she's trying to help us understand the feeling of a funeral and what happens. Maybe she's been through it herself. So that's why I think she uses sound imagery, and that was a really messy analysis, but at least you can see I'm pushing the why, or thinking out the why. Now the second half of today is once again continuing to focus on imagery. We're going to do a creative write. And you're doing this creative write because there is a passage from The Book Thief that I absolutely adore. We haven't talked much about The Book Thief since the start of this semester, so I want to kind of return back to that a little bit. You're going to drink some sparkly grape juice, and this is going to seem really weird, but it connects back to The Book Thief, I promise. You're going to drink the sparkly grape juice, and you're going to do a creative write in your blue books, and you're going to skip lines as you do it. And I want you to use the 5 different imagery types. And the 5 different imagery types are at the bottom of your handout with the correct spelling. And I'm going to explain those real quickly right now. Just like there are 5 senses, there are 5 different imagery types, and these are the different vocabulary words that go with it. Now, you know visual imagery, that's sight, that's pretty easy. Now, when you think of sound imagery, you're thinking of auditory. So if I were talking about Dickinson's poem on the AP test, I would say you see a lot of auditory imagery because blah, 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 blah. The next one is olfactory, which has to do with your nose and your smell. So is the author trying to get you to smell or bring up images of smell as you're reading something? Gustatory is related to your stomach, which is related to taste. So are they trying to evoke some taste imagery? And what purpose are they using those senses for the writing? And then finally you have something called tactile imagery, which is related to touch and movement of how something is being described. So if you touch a table, it might be it's cold. If you touch a stove, it's definitely going to be hot. So those are the different 5 types of imageries, and I want you to try to use them in your writing about the grape juice. And that's why you're drinking the grape juice, because it's going to provoke gustatory, and it might provoke olfactory and tactile and things like that. So I'd like you guys to take about 4, maybe 5 minutes to write and use imagery and drink the grape juice. If you really don't want to, you don't have to, but it kind of helps inspire you. So go. Okay, you just did your imagery writes. Now what I want to do is read a passage from The Book Thief that I love, and that's why I got the sparkly grape juice. This is a passage when Liesl first tastes champagne. Now obviously I can't bring in champagne to you guys, but I can bring the sparkly grape juice because it creates the same effect. It's got the bubbly effect, and it's such a great passage for imagery. So you guys are going to read through this passage, you're going to pick it apart, analyze it, and then talk about it. And once again, pay attention to what type of imagery is being used and why. And remember, there might be other things that are being used to create that imagery, other lit devices, and you could talk about that too. So read through that, go and talk about it, and then you'll hear my thoughts about it. Go. Alright, so like I said, I love this passage just because you have some great imagery types, and I think you do have all of the different imagery types going on. And I think what you have is you have taste imagery especially, or gustatory imagery. So when she's talking about drinking this champagne, she's got fizzy, sickly sweet taste. Later on it talks about how she tries to swallow it, and it's the taste of a glorious broken rule, very dramatic overstatement. It felt great. The bubbles ate her tongue. They prickled her stomach. You have all these wonderful different imagery types. You also have tactile imagery with the warmth of the pins and needles inside of her. You have, I think she talks about the coolness, which is once again tactile. You see every single type of imagery in here, which is why I like this passage. And also you have to ask yourself, what imagery type seems to be the strongest and why? And I think the imagery type that is the strongest in here is the gustatory. And I also think it's interesting how she's using personification and negative diction choices to explain that imagery. Now, it's not negative exactly, but you have the discussion about the, sick, sweet taste of champagne, and then you have when she drinks it, the bubbles ate her tongue, they prickled her stomach. And so you have this very interesting gustatory imagery because it's the first time she's ever experienced drinking this forbidden drink. And the author has to provoke those senses to help you feel like Liesel. I also think, I would argue here, that the diction choices or the way that the gustatory imagery becomes kind of negative or kind of hostile. I mean, the fact the bubbles are eating at her tongue and prickling her stomach is imagery that gets used to help reiterate that this is kind of a forbidden fruit that she's tasting for the first time. So hopefully you're starting to see what imagery is going on. And don't just say, well, there's imagery. Try to pick out what types of imagery you're seeing. I see some gustatory imagery, and I see that that imagery becomes very personified, and I see that that imagery also becomes kind of negative in its diction choices, and all of this kind of wraps up into this big blob of devices, and it does become a little bit overwhelming, but it's important that you notice these things build onto each other. Now, the last thing I want you to do is I'd like you to go back through your creative write and see if you can add or change any of the imagery to serve a stronger purpose. Now, originally I told you to put those 5 different imagery types in there, and you probably did, but in many ways you're just using the imagery for the sake of using imagery because I told you. I want you to go back and see if you can fix it, or see if you can try something like the book thief, like this idea of imagery being kind of devious or personified in a way it's negative because she's getting prickled and bit by the bubbles. Maybe you try something else, kind of like the auditory imagery that Dickinson is using, and why. This is a little bit hard, especially if you struggle with the creative writing, but I want you to go back and make some changes, and if you can use a different colored pen or a pencil so I can see those changes, that would be great. Your closing activity is share these with each other, and your homework is to read 2 more poems that really have a lot of imagery. You're going to read something called The Great Scarf of Birds, and you're going to read My Mistress' Eyes by Shakespeare. And you're going to pick it apart and think about the imagery. And once again, what type of imagery are you seeing, and why are they using that imagery? Turning your mini books and the hard copy of your Foster paper on the way out the door. You're done.